Greetings, friends. This is the next installment of the Daniel 9 series. My name is Daniel Gregg, and today we're going to be talking about Daniel 9:25, right after Daniel 9:24. All right, so hopefully I don't have the autofocus problems I had. I'm kind of learning how to use a little box on the screen, and I only caught it about halfway through the last video, so I'm going to have to keep looking on, trying to set it up so I can see what's going on here. Alrighty, so the title of this paper is Answering Daniel 9 Questions, and this is on Daniel 9:25. Alright, and as usual, I will read the paper I've prepared and I will commentate on it. Alright, so last time we answered two questions. One question was, what is the unit of time used in the prophecy? And the other question was, is the prophecy completed yet? So we went through 7 items and we discovered that none of them have been completed yet. So let's see what I just kind of ad-libbing here. All right. So we discovered specifically in the 7 items, we discovered that the Tamid offering, desolation, that's 2,300 until evening and morning, must be fulfilled before the finish of the 77th. We also discovered that the Ark of the Covenant must be recovered in order to anoint the Holy of Holies with the original oil, which according to tradition was hidden with the Ark. We also discovered that Israel will pledge faithfulness to Messiah before the end, and on a national scale. The time period is also set to bring in everlasting righteousness for Jerusalem and Israel, to put down the rebellion of Satan and to shut him up, and to purge iniquity from Israel and Jerusalem. All right, so some of you may be wondering about a passage in Jeremiah 3 concerning the ark, and so I'll make a few comments on that. Okay, so the passage that we're talking about is Jeremiah 3:16 to 17. Okay, and you can read that. The prophecy, okay, so the prophecy is true for the time period, and I'm speaking of the Jeremiah prophecy here. It's true for the time period when the throne of the Most High, which is in heaven, comes down to Jerusalem. Okay. The meaning of this passage is that the ark simply will not be needed anymore because the heavenly throne has come to earth. So include reading verse 17, Jeremiah 3:17, and you'll see the context there. But before then, before the end of the 77th, the original ark may be restored to the third temple when the temple is rebuilt. Because at first, when Messiah Yeshua restores the kingdom of Israel, he will be spiritually present with Israel as a nation in spirit, just as he is now spiritually present with the remnant of Israel in exile in every assembly and family of Israel. Okay, so you can justify the ark being found and then the ark not being needed anymore by separating the prophecy up into the time periods into which it applies. Okay, so some might call my words speculation, but I always hope for the best hope. When I interpret passages, I try to interpret it according to the best hope. So since it's dealing with prophecy, it's of course future, and it is speculation, but it's speculation based on the best explanation of Scripture I can come up with, and that's considerable. And I try to express it in a hopeful way. So I would hope that the original ark could be found, all right? So that's the way I'm going to interpret things. Okay, sometimes there is more than one possible explanation. I hope to have no fight with anything, I hope to have no fights with anyone about things that aren't that important. or don't really matter. On the other hand, I wish to say what does matter along the way, like faithfulness to Messiah Yeshua and acknowledging that he is a true almighty and everlasting life. Okay, so if anyone has a disagreement with me, I do listen to exhortation, but I have discovered that online exhortations most often evolve into an attack concerning indisputable truths. And this interaction quickly becomes toxic, not so much to me, but certainly to those who have to listen to it alongside. And believe me, I fought those battles, but I wish to take from them only the knowledge gained and to present the truth in the most positive way possible, which means without any toxic rancor. Okay, the worst possible outcome of a battle, a verbal battle, is for someone to steal my joy or anyone else's joy with words, because they're usually not over somebody really trying to be convinced or wanting to be convinced or just seeking or just wanting to know an answer. They're people at loggerheads who aren't going to agree with each other anyway. Okay, so, and believe me, that can happen even if you technically win the battle. People are fragile, including me, and the soul needs nurture. Most often, I would rather not win a debate if winning it creates hard feelings that did not exist before. And of course, when you're in the habit of winning every battle with half your brain tied behind your back, that's hard to overcome just wanting to dive into the debate. But I've regretted it more than once. Okay, so I'm going to put on the screen here the whole text of Daniel 9:25 in the Hebrew interlinear here. This is the only time that you're going to get to see the whole text because I'm going to break it down into little pieces as we discuss it. I've discovered that works much better than trying to maneuver a big text around on the screen. It's better just to screenshot the little pieces that I need. But I'll do it all in order and we'll explain each little bit as we go. But the whole thing is here if you want to come back and refer to it, mark the spot. But for the rest of the video, it's just going to be little pieces. All right. So it might be a little smaller than usual because I got to fit it onto the whole screen. All right, so here's what it says. Literally, or most literally, because it's an interlinear translation. And thou should know, and thou should pay attention, from the going forth of the word for making restoration and for building Jerusalem until an anointed leader be seventh, 7, and sevens, 60 and 2. She will return, and she will have been built spaciously and diligently, and in the distress of the times. So now if you want to read it off the screen for yourself, you read from the English direction, you read backwards. So you read from the right to the left, and I arranged the interlinear words so that you read from the top down first, and then you go to the left for the next word group. Okay, so verse 25 begins in the middle of the first line, and of course, what goes before that is the end of verse 24. So we already did verse 24 in the last video. Okay, so that ends up the Holy of Holies. So I read this literally to you. I put in a few extra definite articles, okay, to the text. So now let's drill into the first two words of this text. Okay, and thou should know, and thou should pay attention. Okay, so I'm not going to read off the Hebrew, although this is Late da'a, here is what we have, so much as to explain the English, because I don't want to bore you with the Hebrew too much, but I want to get you sort of familiar with the Hebrew so that you can understand that the translation is literal and accurate, and to highlight the points where we're talking about where it makes a meaning difference. So this is of first importance. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Okay, so and thou should know. Okay, so if you notice the comments at the end of these two words here, that represents a cohortative or a volative mood, okay, in Hebrew, which I believe was in the ancient Hebrew, okay. It's usually represented by a vowel letter, sometimes by a hey on the end of the word. And so it represents the idea of should or may or would or you want to do something, okay. So, and thou should know, we also could call this the subjunctive mood, which is a term from Greek grammar. And this mood, but this mood in Hebrew has a broader range of meaning than one might think. Okay, so the sense is thou should or thou will want to know, and that thou should or thou will want to pay attention. Okay, so the messenger of Yud He Wav He speaking here wishes us to understand this part of the prophecy in particular. Okay, so pay attention, gain insight, and ponder it, and consider it. He is inviting us to understand his words. Okay, so we can flip the page here. Okay, so in this next little bit of the Hebrew, I've clipped off the next phrase here. Okay, so from the going forth of the word for making restored and for building Yerushalayim. Okay, the question we want to discover the answer to is, when was the starting point of the 77s? Okay, so min motzah. Okay, so that's the first two words, from the going forth of the davar. Okay, the word, for making restored and for building Jerusalem. So lahashiv velavanot Yerushalayim. Okay. So the verb shuv is the root of the word for making restored. So that's the word in the middle of the line there. Okay, so the verb root can mean to cause something to return to a previous state, okay, or to cause a return somewhere. Okay, so restored. I read the words for making restored Yerushalayim in both senses. Okay, so how was this fulfilled and when? Both were done under Nehemiah. Nehemiah restored the walls of the city, and then they caused the city to be re-inhabited. So if you look in Nehemiah 11:1, you'll see after they finished all the festivities of the 7th month, and that year was a sabbatical year, they cast lots to bring 1 in 10 of every person or of the people in the province of Judea to live in the city. So the city was relatively uninhabited and had only a very few houses. So Nehemiah and the elders encouraged and caused the people to return to the city. So they're restoring the population as well as restoring the city walls and the city gates itself. Okay, so we're going to get into some more details on how this was done. All right, the word to restore the city. Okay, so that's given in Nehemiah chapter 2. Okay, and I don't know what version here I clipped out to read from you, but we'll go with it. The king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves," or tombs, okay, "that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. Okay, so ... Now the king has sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. Okay, so Nehemiah directly asked to rebuild the city, and the king gives him permission to rebuild it. Okay, so this qualifies of giving him the word to rebuild it. Okay, Now, of course, word in Hebrew stands for more than it just does in English. In English, it's like one word you say, but in Hebrew, it can be a saying, or even a matter or a subject, um, a phrase, even a whole paragraph can be a word. I suppose in English, we sometimes can use it that way. So the rebuilding of the city is specifically connected to restoring the walls that had recently been broken down. So, according to Nehemiah 1:3, and they said unto me, okay, this is Nehemiah's brother talking, okay, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Okay, and so of course Nehemiah receives this news with shock and dismay. Okay, so since this is more than 100 years after Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, why does he react this way? Well, there's a backstory to this. Okay, and the backstory you can figure out from studying the Persian history surrounding the context of the book of Nehemiah. All right, so the backstory is this. In the latter end of the reign of Xerxes, under the eye of Esther and Mordecai, okay, as the prime minister of Persia. So Mordecai became the prime minister of Persia. Okay, they were rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. Okay, this is referred to in a letter that the enemies of Judah wrote to the king in Ezra chapter 4. Okay, even though no decree had been issued for it. So as you know, the laws of the Medes and Persians cannot be altered when they made the law. So they they over they over they didn't object, okay, to the rebuilding going on under Esther and Mordecai, but there was no specific decree for it. Okay, they didn't object because the Jewish people were in great favor at that time after the defeat of Haman. All right, so they were rebuilding the city of Jerusalem, even though no decree had been issued for it. The people went ahead and rebuilt it. Then came the reign of Artaxerxes. Okay, so there's a typo in the paper here. I'll have to remember to fix it. Okay, so Artaxerxes was a successor to Xerxes. So this is Artaxerxes the first. Okay, so they were almost finished rebuilding it when the revolt of Inaros broke out in Egypt.
My name is Marcoinaros. I am the commander of the Free Navy.
In 458 BC. So the Egyptian wing of the Persian Empire went into revolt at this time. Okay, 458 BC. Judah's enemies complained to the king about the city and slandered Judah, saying that when they finished the city, they too would rebel. Okay, so they accused Judah of wanting to join the revolt, okay, when they finished the construction of Jerusalem. And so the king made them stop building the city. Okay, it was as would be prudent to do when there were military matters afoot at that time. Okay, but the king reserved it for himself to issue a decree to rebuild it. Okay, for he states in Ezra 4:21, until a decree is made by me. So he's not, doesn't sound like he's quite the enemy of the enemies of Judah. The enemies of Judah are just trying to exploit the situation. But the king is still suggesting that he might show favor to the Jews. And of course, with his father, King Ahasuerus, showing great favor to the Jews and doing away with Haman and listening to Esther, of course, he has this legacy. All right. So the revolt of Inaros lasted until 454 BC. Okay. But a few years later, okay, But a few years later, in 449 BC to 446 BC, there was another revolt. Okay, so this was the revolt of the Persian satrap Megabezus. And Megabezus, a satrap, is like a governor of a whole province of Persia. Okay, so the governor of the province across the river, which would include the area of Judea and that whole territory and the countries surrounding that, revolted against the Persian king. Okay, so this is called the revolt of Megabezus. Okay, so this revolt lasted from, let's see, 449 BC to 446 BC. Okay, so the Persian satrap Megabezus revolted against the king. All right, so at the end of this revolt, when the armies of the king and the armies of the satrap were fighting, the local enemies of Judah took occasion to take revenge on Jerusalem. All right, and this revenge took the form of breaking down the walls of Jerusalem and burning the gates with fire. This was something they were not authorized by the king of Persia to do. The king of Persia just said to stop rebuilding the walls of the city. All right, so where were we at? All right, I was ad-libbing a little bit there. Okay, so as I was saying, they broke down the walls and they burned the gates with fire. Okay, so this was at the end of Megabezus' revolt in 446 BC. Now, of course, Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king, which the cupbearer was a very extremely high rank in those times. Okay, it it was like it's like being almost like being second to the Secretary of State. Okay, or being a deputy to the prime up to the prime minister or to the king. It was a position that was held that there might be only 4 or 5 other men of equal rank. Okay, now of course in ancient Persia at the time there was a rank called the peers of the kingdom. Okay, these were the 7 counselors of the king, and they were considered equal to the king, where one ruled, but the king actually had the last say. And this was a system of government or deal that Persia had come up with due to its past history of conflict within the kingdom. All right, so right below these 7 counselors and the king himself were the high officials, and Nehemiah may have been one of 5 or 6 persons of rank right below that. So Nehemiah would have been apprised of pretty much all the goings on and be party to hearing just pretty much everything that was going on in the Persian Empire at that time. All right. So the reason that Nehemiah received the news from his brother of the destruction of the walls, the breaking down of the walls actually. So what enemies do is they'll partially break down the wall of a city and major sections of it. We don't know how extensive the breaking down was. And then they'll burn the gates with fire. And then that, of course, made the city useless for any defensive purposes, of course, unless you rebuilt it. Okay, so the reason that Nehemiah received the news from his brother as fresh news and went into mourning because it was a very recent event. This has nothing to do with the destruction wrought by Nebuchadnezzar about 100 years before this. Actually, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the city, the temple, in 587 BC, and this was in 446. All right, we've lost. Oh, there. It came back on. That means that all the computers are rebooting, but the camera seems to be working now, so we can continue here. All right. We had some T-storms go through here, and they're probably still going on in the county somewhere, so power outages are frequent on this island. I have to constantly make sure my work is saved, otherwise it'll crash with the computer. All right. Okay, so Nehemiah's work on the wall. For this reason, because of the way they destroyed the walls, and the bulk of the rebuilding had been done earlier than Nehemiah. He's doing a repair job. So Nehemiah's work was a repair job on the walls and gates after the city had been rebuilt by earlier efforts. Okay, and though the earlier efforts had been without a decree from the crown. Okay, and this is why Nehemiah's work was done in 52 days. Okay, some of the commentators complain about this, and especially the higher critical ones. They want to say 49 years, or they want to say it was a mistake or something, but it wasn't. All right. Besides Nehemiah, okay, so besides Nehemiah, so now we're going to go and hear what the critics say. Besides Nehemiah, other times are proposed to begin this prophecy. Okay, so Jewish interpreters begin with the destruction of the city by Babylon. All right, but this desperate move was engineered to avoid any connection to Messiah Yeshua. Okay, so we can dismiss that one. All right. I'm not trying to convince a Jewish audience here that doesn't believe in Yeshua. Although if they do look into the discrepancy in Persian history, they will see that their view is really full of historical holes. Okay, something that only with the knowledge of somebody of those times might swallow under Rabbi Akiba, but certainly no modern person with greater knowledge of history can swallow this view. Okay, so here's another view. Some scholars try to connect it with the decree in Ezra 1:3. So I'll read you that decree here, okay? And this is by Cyrus the Great. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. That's from the English Standard Version. Okay, so, but this view also denies any fulfillment by Messiah, since it was too soon. Okay, so the first return under Zerubbabel was almost 100 years before Nehemiah. Okay, something like 90 years before Nehemiah. Okay, but this view also denies any fulfillment by. Okay, I already said that. And also, there's no mention made of rebuilding the city by Cyrus the Great. He's only talking about rebuilding, allowing them to rebuild the temple. Okay. So so we're going to go to interpretation number 3. Most fixate on the decree in Ezra 7:13. Okay, and that says, I make a decree that any one of the people of Israel or their priests and Levites in my kingdom who freely offers to go to Jerusalem may go with you. For you are sent by the king and his 7 counselors to make inquiries about Judah and Jerusalem according to the law of your God. But this is also similarly a desperate move. When Ezra arrived, Jerusalem didn't need to be built or inhabited. The city had already been restored, and the people to it. Okay, so Ezra didn't find the city in the condition that Nehemiah found it. And also there's no mention made, not even of rebuilding the temple. And of course, no mention is made of rebuilding the city here either. Okay, the decree is aimed at correcting a problem that occurred with the temple. All right, so this Ezra decree theory, in other words, the Ezra 7 decree theory, is the most popular alternative theory to Nehemiah. What exposes it as faulty is that Ezra did not go to Jerusalem on the dates that his advocates suppose. And what they suppose is he went in 458 or 457 BC. And of course, that would be smack dab right in the middle of the Inaros revolt. Okay? They assumed that because Ezra, or the book of Ezra, comes before Nehemiah, that Ezra speaks of Artaxerxes I in connection to himself in Ezra 7. They also assumed that the covenant formed in Daniel 9:27 to cause the sacrifice and offering to cease was Messiah himself. Okay, so these interpreters take an anti-temple, anti-Levitical view in their interpretation, and we shall see that this isn't correct. They also, like Jewish interpreters, generally said, or they generally say, the 77s are completely completed, already completed. Okay, and of course, that was the subject of the last video where we went through 7 items that were not completed, all right, in detail. Okay, so the 77s aren't over and done with, which this view tends toward. There's ways to wriggle out of it, but they're not really very good. And I haven't run across it very extensively. Major advocates of this view don't seem to advocate the minor ways of wiggling out of it. Okay, so in the okay, so we did that. All right. So, only Nehemiah can meet the criteria stated in the passage, namely, to restore the city of Jerusalem, to rebuild it specifically, because the passage says to rebuild. Okay, so if we look back here, the verb will live note, okay, and for rebuilding, it's a specific infinitive word there that means for rebuilding. Okay, so only Nehemiah can meet that criteria. Okay, and also specifically to restore the inhabitants of Jerusalem, which isn't the same thing as restoring the exiles to the province of Judea, but restoring the inhabitants. It's not the same thing as restoring the temple either. Okay, so when did Nehemiah go? The year that he went to rebuild the city and repopulate it was 445 BC. Okay, so how do we arrive at 445 BC, since in those times the BC and AD scale wasn't used? It was invented by a Scythian monk in the 6th century AD. Okay, so Nehemiah states that it was the 20th year of Artaxerxes in chapter 2. Okay, for sound reasons, scholars do not doubt that this was Artaxerxes the First, also called Longhand. So, the Venus Astronomical Tablet. Okay, so that would be abbreviated VAT, V-A-T, and then they give a catalog number for it, 5047. We'll refer to that as just VAT 5047. Supplies sufficient planetary and lunar observations to securely date the 11th year of this king to 454 BC. Okay, so planetary data, a regnal year of the king, and you can get an astronomical fix on what this is in absolute time without actually having any dependence on the invention or deployment of the BC AD scale. All right, so the 20th year is 9 years later in 445 BC. So even with, okay, so that's the astronomical dating, as near as absolute as you can get. Okay, so even without this tablet, there are other sufficient historical records to arrive at the same conclusion, and I'm talking about other archaeological records and Ptolemy's canon and history as it was passed down from the Persians to the Greeks to the Romans. And there are also other astronomical texts that would, the Persian, the Magi, okay, the Persian astrologers, making a plenitude of observations was a big deal with them, and they charted this out in meticulous accuracy in the calendar, especially during the times of the latter Persian kings. this became a very systematic science to them, where they made regular observations. So there's really no way to move the reign of Artaxerxes according to the standard Persian calculation. All right. So, okay, so I put up on the screen here our next phrase, which we're going to talk about from verse 25. All right. Until an anointed leader be 7 or we could read it until an anointed leader be 7. Okay, so in the last video I discussed that this word Shavaim or Shevaim, that's why I left the vowels out because I pronounced it 2 different ways. It can mean 7 periods or it can mean the 7th year itself. All right, on the last word of the clause, okay, and that would be Shiva, 7, okay. So that's the number 7. So we're counting out the 7s, the sabbatical or Shemitahs. Okay, so on the last word of this clause, the Masoretic text places a major disjunctive accent. Okay, that I think it would be called an atnach. Okay, and I'll stick it up on the screen here, but it looks like the upside down Y between the ayin and the hey at the end of the word. Okay, and the force of this accent is that of a period or a semicolon. Okay, so it's a major break in the text. Okay, so this implies that 2 anointeds are to be comprehended in the one usage of the word Mashiach here, okay, or anointed. So, quote, until an anointed leader be 7, semicolon, and 7s and 60 and 2, okay, and then another anointed, okay, that's implied. That is, an anointed comes at the end of 7 sevens, and an anointed comes at the end of 62 sevens. To make this point clearer, okay, if you still don't get it, we could just translate the wav with the word also instead of and. Okay, so in other words, until an anointed leader be 7 sevens. Also 7, 60, and 2. Okay, so until an anointed leader be 7s, 7. Stop. Also 7s, 60, and 2. Okay? So this is what the traditional accent marks imply. Okay, we should not attribute the placement of the accent here to rabbinic mischief, however. I know it can be easy to think that because most Christian interpreters have not found a way to figure out what this means in the text, because they have erring chronologies of the Daniel 9 and the Passion chronology. All right, but I'm saying it's not rabbinic mischief, okay? Though there is certainly mischief to what rabbinic and Jewish interpreters will make of the major disjunctive accent here. They'll make a lot of mischief out of it, but its existence there in the first place is not mischief. Okay, but the very fact that the text does not say 60 and 9 sevens. Okay, which is if that's all it said was 60 and 9 sevens, then that would imply 1 anointed. Okay, with respect to 1 anointed suggests there are 2. The breaking of the time into 2 subsets suggests 2 anointeds. Okay, so that's where this idea of putting a disjunctive accent here comes from. All right, so now let's move on to some explanation of this. So from 445 okay, so I write the year down, 445/444 BC. All right, so what does that notation mean? That means from Tishri 1 of 445 BC to the last day of Elul in 444 BC. Okay, so that's two Julian years makes up 1 year of the sabbatical cycle. All right, and in this case, it actually is the sabbatical year that we're talking about, the Shemitah year, the year of release. Okay, so from there we move forward 7 sevens, or 7 Shemitah years, okay, and come to the year 403, 402 BC. So that would be the seventh of 7 Shemitah years, okay, which is the seventh of the 7 sevens. So Ezra sets out from Persia in 398 BC under Artaxerxes II, and arrives and finishes his reform work in 397 BC, before the 62 sevenths begin. So the 7 sevenths finish, but before the next sabbatical year comes around, Ezra has gone and done his reform work and has finished it. Okay, so now I should explain that Ezra was a priest, and priests are anointed with the holy anointing oil, so the priests are considered anointed ones. All right, so this is why Ezra qualifies to fulfill this part of the prophecy. Okay, Ezra says in Ezra chapter 7, he says it was the 7th year of Artaxerxes, which we know was Artaxerxes II. Okay, so I'm going to explain that now. If I'm talking too fast for you guys again now, all right? We can also determine from the priestly line that Ezra served as governor of Judea after Nehemiah. Okay, Nehemiah was contemporary to the high priest Eliashib. Okay, and Ezra to the high priest Yohanan. Okay, or Yohanan. Okay, it also has been pointed out that if Ezra came 13 years before Nehemiah, he was such a complete failure that he would never be worthy of his position after having neglected to teach the Torah. So Ezra was sent with a complete and utter mandate to mandate and enforce Torah in Judea, including the observance of the feast, the regulation of the temple, and even to dissolving mixed marriages, which he did, and he exercised this authority when he went there. But we find when in Nehemiah chapter 8, when the Torah was read, that the people are ignorant of, it's like they had never read the law before. They're ignorant about the separation of Israel from the Ammonites and the nations around them. They appear to be ignorant of the Feast of Tabernacles. They're distressed by this fact that they're hearing the Torah for the first time for many of them. Okay, so to suggest that Ezra had been there for 13 years with the mandate that Artaxerxes had given him is to suggest that Ezra did not use his authority and was a complete failure. Okay, so Ezra would have, under these conditions, he could never have been the great reformer that he's referred to by Judaism. Okay, and actually that's biblical. Ezra is the one who pulled together the canon of Torah and edited the books of Chronicles and corrected many other problems. Okay, so Ezra was surely present in Jerusalem with Nehemiah as a young priest. Okay, but he was a young priest and a young and rising priest, but he didn't have a mandate from the king of Persia. He didn't have a governing administration. Okay, he was present when Nehemiah was there. He may have been in Jerusalem before, but his role wasn't what it was before or afterward. Okay, so he did participate in reading the Torah. Okay, so he did have enough rank to take that position to the people. All right, and of course Jerusalem had been ruined and neglected, so it wasn't like Ezra could go to Jerusalem and organize events because the enemies had destroyed the walls and burned the gates. So conditions simply weren't right. All right. So, but after that time, Ezra went back to Persia, and he got the mandate that the king of Persia gave him after 7 sabbatical years passed. So Nehemiah was a senior statesman before Ezra's career advanced. Okay, so that's the backstory on why Ezra comes second. All right. So now let's go on to the 62:7 part of this passage. The 62:7s bring us forward to the second anointed, which is Messiah Yeshua himself. All right. The 62nd Sabbath year, or Shemitah, was AD 3233. Okay. So that's counting in the same 7 year cycle. Okay. When it finished, and just a side point, there's only one way you can fit the required number of sabbatical periods into the historical period. You can't bump it forward or backwards. You'll mess up the chronology. You'll mess up the fact that the Torah was read in the Shemitah year by Ezra as commanded by Torah. You'll mess up the debt forgiveness that Nehemiah compelled the people on the eve of the Shemitah year, because they were supposed to remit debts in the Shemitah year. Okay, so the 62nd Sabbath year was AD 3233. Okay, so when it finished, Messiah was in the last half year of his ministry, which is from Tishri AD 33 to Nisan AD 34. All right, so let's put the last snippet here from Daniel 9:24 here up on the screen. Okay, so she will be restored, and she refers to the city here because a ir, or a city in Hebrew, is of a feminine gender. Okay, so the pronoun is she will be restored, and she will have been rebuilt spaciously and diligently and in the distress of the times. Okay, so to shove, I repointed that as a call passive because it's clearly passive. The action's being done to Jerusalem. And then we have a Nephal following it in parallel. All right. So she will be restored. She refers to the city that is Jerusalem. All right, explain that. And she will have been built spaciously. So that's the verb rachov. Okay. So Nehemiah records that the city was large for the number of workers in it and the number of people in it. And few houses were built. So it was spacious. Now, rachov in more modern Hebrew means street. Okay, on account of a street being a wide space between buildings. But the word here appears to have a more general force, meaning wide, spacious, expansive. Okay, and also has the force of an adverb. Okay, because it comes after the verb, it modifies the verb. So, and she will have been built spaciously. Okay, and diligently, another adverb. Wacharutz. Okay, so, and diligently. And they finished it in 52 days, which they were about as diligent as you can be to complete all that repair work in 52 days. So that's quite the diligence. In fact, it's so diligent that the higher critical scholars have doubted that they did it in 52 days. Okay, and in the distress of time, uvsok, all right, ha itim, ha'itim, okay. So 8 is the Hebrew word for time, or itim would be the plural, and in the distress of the times. So one only has to read the book of Nehemiah to understand all the pressures he was under and the enemies that kept attacking him and trying to frustrate the work and get the work halted. Okay, so of course they failed in all these attempts, but it was certainly distressful times. I mean, just previous there had been 2 revolts, and then they accused Nehemiah of trying to conduct his own revolt. All right. So that brings us to the end of our explanation of Daniel 9:25, and I trust that you learned a few unique things from this passage that maybe you didn't know before. This is a straightforward historical interpretation of the passage concerning 2 anointeds, Ezra and Yeshua. Ezra comes after the 7 sevens, and Yeshua comes after the 62 sevens. All right, so this is the first two time periods in which the 77s are broken down to be. And thank you for listening. This is Daniel Gregg, over and out.